Hello and welcome to the IT News Podcast, brought to you by the State of Security Report and Interactive. I'm Ray Crozier, Editor-in-Chief of IT News. Stick around and hear Dan Cox, CTO of Interactive, discuss the necessity of hybrid cloud environments and the importance of consistent security models and resource optimization for effective cloud migration. But first, we hear from Classifieds Business Gumtree Group's CTO, Paul Russell, whose team has recently emerged from an 18-month program of work, transforming whole business processes and standing up 7 new core business systems and a dozen smaller ones.
I joined at a time when there's a fair amount of change in the business. I actually joined 6 months after eBay sold all of their classifieds business worldwide to Adevinta, and I joined just after Adevinta then announced that they were on-selling what is now the Gumtree Group. So it was a bit of a double whammy there. And for context, when I say the Gumtree Group, that's Gumtree Australia, Cars Guide, and Auto Trader in Australia.
Do you want to talk about what that meant as your remit coming in as the CTO?
Sure. Because a company had been sold twice, when I started, we had a shocking turnover. Honestly, 2 people were resigning almost every week. We were losing talent really rapidly. And so my remit was 2 things. One is to lead a team that was in crisis. And the other one was to start building great product features for the 3 websites so that we can continue to grow the business. So it was a fairly big ask. Added on top of that, of course, we needed to first help Adevinta sell the business because there's a fair amount of work that goes into working with all the potential buyers. And then, of course, once that had happened, separating from Adevinta. Really, the focus of the job has always been building those great product features, but the sale and separation for the last nearly 2 years has been a fairly big sideline as well.
Do you want to just separate that into 2 parts? Firstly, talk a little bit about what you did in terms of stabilization of the IT and the technology development team, I guess. I don't know how you group it as a technology function.
Our tech team is mostly software engineers building on those websites. That's the vast majority of our team. We've got our SRE team who look after the infrastructure and now some internal IT as well and security, but we didn't have back then. And we make up more or less half the company because we are a product-based company. And as I mentioned there, the turnover was dramatic. It was 1 or 2 people leaving every week. I believe the reason for that was there'd been quite a vacuum from a leadership point of view in the tech team for a while. There was uncertainty about the sale. There was uncertainty about our direction. The team was disengaged. I'm really happy to say it only took me about 6 weeks to turn that around. And I knew I'd done it when someone who had resigned through that wave, he was the first one to, I think it was 2 days before, he was due to leave saying, actually, I've changed my mind. I want to stay. And so his leaving drinks turned into staying drinks, and we've had virtually no turnover since then. So it was fantastic. It was honestly the most rewarding thing I've done, I think, in my career. And it's an absolutely amazing team. We have so little turnover, highly engaged people now. But yeah, when I started, it was pretty dire.
And so the other aspect you mentioned there that you're working on was helping the sale of the business and then the separation. Now, we're going to talk a lot about the separation in this, but do you want to just talk about what coming into a sale process looks like from a technology perspective?
Yeah, sure. The managing director, the CFO, and myself were the ones who were walking around to the various potential buyers, explaining the business and the situation it was in and the opportunity that it represents. And different buyers wanted different levels of detail. There's the usual data room and all of those sorts of things. And for someone who was really quite new, it was interesting because I had a really rapid onboarding because I had to go and explain a business that I had only just joined. But of course, technology is a really important part of it. And if you think about it, when you're buying a new business, you understand the financials, but you want to understand the assets you're buying as well and their technology-based assets. Just being really clear what we had, what we didn't have, what our path forward was, and then what the opportunity was to grow the business. And that took quite some time.
The third thing that you mentioned there was that previously you didn't have specific IT resources. They were part of the previous owner or owner's provision. So we'll get into it a little bit, but I wondered if you can just talk a little bit about what the IT strategy or the technology strategy looks like. How do you look at technology strategy? Is it mostly based on product and then there's a separate IT strategy, or is it all merged into one technology strategy?
Initially, when I started, it was all about product development, and that was the strategy. But since we have separated from our former owner, we've added our internal IT or internal business systems, which includes internal IT and security to that as well. So there are really 3 pillars to it at the moment. The absolute focus is, of course, building those products because that is our business. But now we run our own back office, which we never did before. And so we are running it. We need to optimize it. So there's a good strategy around that. And then the final thing is security. And I guess we can talk about it in more detail in terms of how we stood up all these systems in a really short amount of time. But the great thing about starting from scratch is that we can put in place the right security at the beginning. So we set them up. We now need to manage them so we can optimize them and make sure they don't degrade. But we didn't bring any legacy baggage with us, so we don't have to go and fill any gaps, for example.
So maybe a good time to talk a little bit about the IT and system separation from Adevinta. So I gather you had around 18 months to complete it. Can you talk a little bit about how you approached it? And secondly to that, whether you've worked on similar separations of this nature before?
I guess to answer the second part first, I've never done this before. I've been involved on the other side of it a lot of times. I've lost track of how many acquisitions I've been in on the acquiring side. The closest I've come to a similar sort of situation, I was working at Salmat and they had sold one of their 3 divisions and I was running technology for one division and they sold one of the other ones. So I watched it from afar, but I'd never been involved in it. And so it was a bit of a learning exercise. It was honestly just a whole lot of hard work, some hard thinking and a whole lot of work to make it happen. The background for it is we were just the Australian office of a global tech company. And as you would imagine, any sort of global business would have centralized everything that they could centralize. We were lucky enough that we had control of our own products in Australia, so Cars Guide, Auto Trader, and Gumtree, but we didn't have any of the back office systems, billing, finance, HR, and all of those sorts of things, and a handful of product-based features as well, like the Gumtree messaging system. So all of those were owned and operated by our former owner, and we had 18 months to get out of every single one of them, which is honestly craziness. A sensible person would chew off 2 or 3 of those in that sort of period. I think that's about 7 major systems. There are more than another dozen little systems, probably over 50 different contracts for tools and services that we were provided by our former owner, again, just as the local office. I had a good hard think about how we're going to achieve that because it's a really big undertaking. And people joke about changing the engines of the plane while it's still flying. But these are the systems that run our business. And if we can't send out bills or we can't pay people, then we're in a fair bit of hot water. So we had a fairly critical project to run in a really short amount of time. And so to approach that, as I say, a lot of thought went into exactly how we're going to do that and came up with quite a few different principles as part of that strategy. The first one is to make sure we chose the right size system. So we were leaving a big global corporate which used SAP, for example, for finance. And SAP is not appropriate for a 200-person company like us. So we choose the right size system, so good mid-tier ones. And because we're choosing new systems, we get to choose ones that were leading. So maybe something I'll probably say a few times, we didn't bring any baggage with us. We just got to choose a good system rather than having to be stuck in some old system for some legacy reason. We didn't have that anymore. The second thing is we standardized everything. And by that, I mean, we adapted to the system and used the system in the way that it was designed to be used, rather than trying to change the system to fit the way that we thought it should be used, which is really interesting because people's first inclination is to go and customize things as much as they can. We like to do it this way. We like to do it that way. We were changing everything. So we were designing everything from scratch. And when we designed all of our processes, we designed them with the systems in mind to use them the way they're meant to be used, which obviously really speeds things up a great deal. But the other advantage is, of course, the total cost of ownership goes down because we've not customized things. In all of those systems, the only actual customization we have done is the integration layer in Salesforce between our platforms, so Gumtree, Cars Guide, Auto Trader, and the billing component, because there's a whole lot of complex data conversion to happen. But that's it out of all of those systems. The next thing we did was we wanted to minimize system integration because that's really hard. And so we chose systems that work together, which when you think about the process of choosing so many systems in a short amount of time, that's hard. But then if you start whittling them down fairly quickly, things that work together made it a whole lot easier, but again, made it run faster. The next thing we did, I mentioned we chose best in breed type systems. They're all SaaS based. So we didn't deploy a single server in the rollout of all of these systems. They're all SaaS based systems. They're all configured only. And again, it just makes so many things so much simpler. We got to bake in security as we're doing this. We did get a lot of help rolling these systems out, and we rolled them out the right way, the way you meant to roll them out. And yeah, got to bake security in, so don't have to go back and add it. A lot of planning went into this, given it's a lot to do in a short amount of time. One of the big things I think we did was really we exited whole processes rather than individual systems. For example, if you think about the process of finance and billing and so on, if we replaced just one of those systems, we'd have had to unhook that component from our previous owner systems, hook in our new one, and then pipe the output back into one of their systems. So that's a lot of work, and then do it system by system. That's really hard. So we did, for example, replace finance, CRM, and billing all in one go. So that whole process changed all at once. And so we just had a cutoff. We stopped using the old system, migrated the data, started using the whole new process, made it so much simpler. Another one, we did both the HR system and the payroll system together rather than having to get our new HR system talking to their payroll system and then replace the payroll system. We just replaced them both at the same time. A lot of these were fairly pragmatic things to do because we just didn't have that much time. 18 months really isn't that much time when you think about that list of systems, and talked about 7 of them. The big ones were finance, CRM, billing, a data warehouse, the HR system, the payroll system, and the recruitment system. So an awful lot went into that. And then change management. So that's a lot of change for a business to go through. For a lot of people, their entire job works differently now. And there's not a single person in the company it did not touch. And so change management was a really important part of all of that. Some things we did, for example, we selected Salesforce for CRM because we were so deep in Salesforce, we could only do so much change at once. It's our Salesforce, it's a new implementation, but at least people didn't have to learn Salesforce. Same for expenses, for example. We used Concur. We didn't go through any sort of selection process. Concur is not particularly expensive. Everyone knows how to use it. We just have our own version. So we made a whole lot of pragmatic choices like that because you can't do an RFP for 20 odd systems in that time frame. You have to make pragmatic decisions. And that's what we did. And I think that following those principles really tightly is the only reason we got to the end in time.
There's a huge amount to unpack there. Just firstly, you mentioned using systems as they were meant to be used, so not overly customizing what you sort of took on from a technology perspective. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I guess what enabled you to do that? Because it would have either meant unwinding a lot of previous customizations that people relied on, or perhaps on the flip side, I'm imagining that perhaps now there's a broader array of specific SaaS-based tools that are applicable to a lot of different industry domains and sort of sectors and subsectors, and whether that played into it at all.
From a back office point of view, I don't think we're particularly different, if at all, from a really large number of companies. So if you think about a finance system, it's about the P&L and the balance sheet, it's cash reconciliation, all those standard processes, and we really are the same as everyone else. There's configuration to do to set up things like our chart of accounts and so on. But there's approvals can just be however the approvals work in that system. There's no particular reason we need to have special approvals, just as a random example. So I think that's one of the reasons that allowed us to do it. The other thing that allowed us to do it is we were in a fairly strange and difficult situation in that we didn't actually understand how a lot of our back office processes worked for our company, because they were provided by a centralized team somewhere in Europe who weren't particularly communicative, and we were a very small market in a global business. And so they couldn't exactly tell us, or we couldn't definitely find out how some of these things work right now. So it was much faster, rather than to try to take the lid off that can of worms, understand all of that in an enormous amount of detail, weed out what's in their processes because they're a big global company versus what we need. That's really hard. You start from first principles. We just need to run expenses and approve them and so on. It was simpler and faster. So we started from scratch. And if you're going to start with a blank piece of paper, then the easiest thing to do is to use the systems the way that they're meant to be used. Again, taking expenses as an easy example, going through the onboarding process with the vendor. They have the list. These are the things you need to decide and configure, and off we went and did it. And it's much faster than trying to understand how it may have worked with our previous owner and all the baggage that might have come with for all the different markets that they have to support, what applies to us or not. We could just not do that.
That makes sense as well in the context of what you were talking about in terms of exiting whole processes, because if you don't necessarily understand how all of the sort of individual components of that process are stitched together and architected, then rather than unpick that, then it's probably much easier to work out what you need that process to do and then work from there.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely much easier. I don't want to undersell it though. Much easier means going from enormously difficult to just very difficult. A lot of our people work so hard to understand this and to work it out. Of the implementation of finance, CRM, and billing, for example, I think we probably spent half of that time understanding what we needed to do to support our business and designing those processes, whereas normally it would mostly be implementation. So we spent a lot more time than we expected up front just trying to find out what it is we actually need to do to make the business run properly.
Was there a period where you ran both processes, old and new, side by side?
No, we didn't. It was all hard cut over. That amount of time, there's no luxury for things like parallel runs, unfortunately. We're less worried about that because we had done that work up front and really understood what it is we needed to do. And to some degree, work backwards. So we know we need to get an invoice out to our customers. We know that it needs to have their subscriptions on it. We know it needs to have any of their overages on it. We know where that comes from. Work back, work out all the things that we need to input into that. It's a subscription-based business. That's really quite common. We weren't reinventing too many wheels and all of that, really. There are absolutely gaps. So we've gone live, the system's running, it's running, but there are gaps. There's manual workarounds and so on. There's definitely a lot of opportunity for us to optimize, but it was a bit of an existential situation, really. I mean, if we didn't get this done, we were out of business. And Adevinta sold quite a lot of markets around the world over the time. And I know of at least one example where they were running the business in spreadsheets for weeks afterwards. So missing the deadline has some fairly significant consequences. Overall, I think the team's done an amazing job to get where we got to.
The other thing you mentioned was you were able to bake in security. Did you want to just give us a sense, I guess, what that part of the program of work particularly looked like?
Because they're all SaaS-based systems and they're all generally role-based access. We built a governance model so we understand how we wanted to run these things, worked out who the right people were and what the right missions were. That wasn't too hard. One of the things that helped us a lot, I mentioned we really want to minimize integrations. We ended up choosing Salesforce, as I mentioned, as the CRM. We actually chose Financial Force, and now it's called Satinia. It's our finance system. And that's one of the biggest integrations companies like ours need to do. And there was no integration because it all runs on Salesforce. And the security model around that is the same. So another big shortcut that we took. It's a great system. And we did actually, of all the systems we did a bit of a bake-off with, finance was one of those. It's a great system, but it has some big added benefit. There's no integration between the CRM and billing system and the finance system. They all just run on the same platform.
Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about the full SaaS approach that you've undertaken? So you've mentioned it a couple of times, but did you want to just, I guess, discuss how you landed on a full SaaS approach versus other options?
I guess there's a couple of reasons why I ended up being fully SaaS. The first is we were starting from scratch, and so we could choose best-in-class systems, and that's what they are. People build modern systems as SaaS these days, and if we were to choose an older system, then maybe it would have been an option to have something that we hosted. So that really steered us in that direction to some degree. A really important part of our strategy that I put in our egg strategy more or less from when I started is we use managed services wherever we can. And that's not just in terms of the back office, that products are like that as well. So for example, our databases are managed services. We use Elasticsearch, but it's a managed service. We're not running Elasticsearch. We're not in the business of operating that sort of infrastructure. We're in the business of running our products and things that are unique to us. So I don't want to have a team of people running finance systems and HR systems. It's a distraction from what is the core of our business. And so those two things really point us towards SaaS. It's a whole lot faster, and it seemed like it would also lower the total cost for us. SaaS systems aren't particularly expensive. They benefit from scale. Their hosting benefits from better scale than what we would have. And as I said, we don't have to pay for people to manage them. And it really helped on the speed aspect as well.
So we've talked a lot about back end. It might be useful to talk about more of your core business as well and the front end. And so I'm assuming that in terms of the migration, this has allowed, first and foremost, continuity of the business operations. But is there things that have been set up in the back end now that also enable you to enhance the core operation, the core function in terms of product development and feature development, and really push different experiences to the customer front end?
Not specifically from the back end system migration aspect. There were some product-based systems we used from our former owner as well. Probably the biggest one was the Gumtree messaging system. So the system that buyers and sellers use to talk to each other. We had to replace that. We probably would replace that even if we didn't have to because of the sale. The old system wasn't particularly great. But that was an enormous piece of work. That took us about 7 months to do. Migrated hundreds of millions of messages, but a much better experience. So for example, the old system did a relatively average job at trying to identify potentially dodgy messages, whereas the new one is able to leverage machine learning, and we just see it pulling out way more messages than what the old one ever did before. An industry issue that we all have is fraud and spam. We're doing lots of different things to tackle that. One of those is to having a much better moderation system in that messaging platform so that we can remove that are not legitimate.
Obviously, you've gotten to this point now with your technology infrastructure. Where are you going next?
It's a really exciting time for us because the last 18 months has had this really big distraction. So we have done a fair number of product enhancements, which is great, but we also were fairly distracted with doing all these other things. So the great thing is we can really focus on our products now. Gumtree as a product, for example, has been well maintained, but hasn't really been moving forward in the speed at which it needs to. So we've got a couple of really big projects that we're focusing on now. One is redesigning the front end just to make it much more usable for buyers and sellers. And the other is we're looking at introducing payments, as you'll see in classified sites around the world, where you can actually use Gumtree in a secure payment mechanism to buy and to ship goods between places. Gumtree has always been a local-based product up to now. But if you can do payments and shipping, then suddenly the whole of Australia is open for people to buy and sell goods. That could be a really big game changer for us. Great from a trust and safety point of view, but really good for buyers and sellers to open up the market for them. And we couldn't really focus on that before because we were distracted with all of those migration projects. But now that we have the capacity, really doubling down on some of those big projects.
Businesses are embracing embracing cloud faster than ever, with Gartner predicting that spending on public cloud platforms will grow by 20.4% this year. But as Interactive Chief Technology Officer Dan Cox explains, running infrastructure and applications in the cloud requires close attention to security.
Getting to the cloud is the beginning of the journey, not the end. It unlocks an awful lot of potential and possibility after what can be a heroic effort to get into cloud. What it does from a security point of view is really change the paradigm on the responsibility matrix, the attack surface. In our experience, no decent sized organization is all in on cloud. And often cloud is the plural. You can be in cloud, but it'd be in multiple clouds. Consuming more as a service is a great method of improving your security posture. There's an in-house IT teams can reduce the complexity that they end up being responsible for, particularly some of the cloud native solutions, a much leaner attack surface and quite a sophisticated posture straight out the box.
Many companies opt to improve security by building cloud native applications, but that has its own security implications.
See two camps. There's the builders in building applications to directly service their customers. You can modernize the app to a certain degree if you own it. It's got almost untold potential and lots of creativity can be applied, both in how you innovate and how you secure that. So it's probably the hardest, but also the most option and feature rich. But not every organization is building their own apps or their IT estate is more than just apps that they're building. There's off-the-shelf applications, SaaS-based services for productivity. You're buying a cloud platform for most of your infrastructure. You might still also have a server room with a more traditional stack in it, because not all these apps were born in the same generation and some are easier to harden and protect than others. If the application can't be modernized, you need to build mitigating controls somewhere else. So you might need a complementary security product or isolate the application in a particular way.
Securing a diverse range of applications and capabilities demands a clear assessment of current workloads, security, and risk management capabilities.
It generally starts with needing some sort of baseline. There's a lot of MSPs like us that would help collate and audit an environment. You can line these assessments up to various different frameworks. So depending on your industry, your vertical, your region, we can pick the right framework that suits you, whether it's an Essential A to NIST or what have you. And then draw up a remediation plan. And we like to keep things simple and put things in buckets of easy, medium, and hard, or fix the foundations and then move on to the more intermediate stuff and do the advanced stuff last. And these days, you can get an assessment done within a couple of weeks. You can have a remediation report available to you within a month and a roadmap available to you within a quarter. So it's not a big investment of time, energy, or effort to get that baseline built.
It's important that companies moving to the cloud consider where and how strategic partners can add value.
Sometimes you can be looking at a vendor for one or two things that you like the look of. You've got to think bigger than that. If you pick a tier one cloud provider, make maximum use of that ecosystem. We often find that there is untapped value in the platform. Sometimes people are paying for that. Everything that just plugs like a Lego in an ecosystem is highly advantageous, particularly to small and mid-sized businesses that are trying to do this within in-house IT teams. You can leverage off the maturity of the technology just playing nicely together.
For all of their benefits, many executives are still recoiling at the cost of new security platforms, which can force technology leaders to get creative.
Budget remains a concern for all, and I come in and do a consolidation exercise and an optimization assessment first. We start with how do you maximize the investment you have today, particularly around a Microsoft, say, where there is an awful lot of value right out the box within your E5 license or something similar. That could be optimizing consumption and turning off spare resources, or consolidating tools and software products into a single ecosystem or a single vendor. Particularly as you get into the cloud ecosystems, there's lots of levers you can pull to create budget that you then ultimately reinvest. So you come out with the same total investment, but with more value to the organization or a hardened business at the end of it.
AI is one of the most transformative forces for businesses today, but applying it to cloud security remains a challenge.
You can't go far these days without running into the AI conversation. There is a massive paradigm shift and something that we all need to learn and leverage from. In a security context, it comes back down to those first principles. 9 times out of 10, a security exploit starts with something that's quite primitive as the initial entry point. It's a non-patch server. It's a weak link in the chain where maybe the servers were okay, but the endpoints or the mobile devices weren't in the purview of the IT policy, and they're the weak spots. We think about enabling AI, doing the smart things fast and simple. Make sure you align your security program with what your business needs and invest in the core value creating basics first before you get carried away with some of the flashy stuff.
That's it for this fortnight's episode. Stay tuned for the next one. For all the latest headlines and happenings in Australian technology news, visit itnews.com.au. And while you're there, check out the 2024 IT News State of Security Report, where we delve into crucial security trends and validate them with end users.